Around the year 50 or 51 of the Common Era, a boat was traveling along the eastern coast of the Greek peninsula heading toward Athens. On that ship was a man fleeing from a recent attempt on his life. That man's name was Saul, later to be known as the Apostle St. Paul, perhaps one of the least understood men in history. Within a few days of his arrival at what's believed to be the Port Piraeus, this man will set in motion events that will hold tremendous cultural and religious significance for the history of Western civilization.
When Paul arrives in Athens, he could not have imagined what was about to happen, that a new religion called Christianity would emerge through him and the teaching of another Jew, Jesus of Nazareth, and would spread throughout the world. To understand Paul, we must look past all the historical baggage that later Christianity imposed on him. Let's try to put ourselves in his shoes and see what really happened. Who was this particularly unknown man who, in fear of his life, fled to Athens? How did this journey become one of the most transformational moments in the history of the Western world?
Despite popular belief that sees him as a Christian thinker, missionary, and saint, Paul had been a passionate Jew all of his life. He was born in the city of Tarsus in today's southeast Turkey to a wealthy Jewish family. He was highly educated in Greek philosophy and culture, and well-versed in the Hebrew Bible, widely spread at the time in its Greek translation known as the Septuagint.
Paul was driven by a strong conviction that the end of the world was imminent. This belief is known as eschatology, from the Greek word eschaton, meaning the end. He was convinced that the way to survive this fast approaching end of the world was by adhering to a resurrected Messiah, Jesus Christ.
Paul was convinced he knew who that Messiah, that Christ, was. A Jewish man named Jesus who was executed by the Romans and was believed by his followers to have risen from the dead. With tremendous urgency and effort, Paul then spent the next 30 years traveling the eastern Mediterranean world, the regions of Syria, Turkey, then called Asia Minor, and Greece. His quest takes him from one Jewish community to another to spread the word about the eschaton. His goal was to organize groups of people that believed in Jesus and thus will be saved from this looming end. Not everyone liked this message. That summer, he barely escaped the angry Jewish mob in northern Greece. Fleeing by the sea, he heads south.
When Paul arrives in Athens, the city and the entire land of Greece has been under Roman rule for nearly 200 years, but Athens still featured much of its cultural splendor.
In the past, it was the home of the great Athenian philosophical schools, the famous Academy of Plato and the Lyceum of his student Aristotle. Even in the Roman era, it was the center for teaching and learning, its streets alive with philosophers. Wealthy families from all over the Mediterranean sent their sons and daughters to study there. The city also is home to some of the greatest architecture of ancient times, crowned by the sacred temple of Athena on the Acropolis.
The Temple of Zeus behind me is one of the greatest, most impressive monuments in the city, and probably in the entire Mediterranean. It was only partially built and finished by Paul's arrival. But keep in mind, in the past, it was not an archaeological site like we see it today, but rather a center of worship, with statues, altars, sacrifices, and rituals being performed here on a daily basis. It, like many other monuments in the city, in particular the Acropolis behind me, triggered something in Paul and affected him emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually.
Much of Paul's whereabouts in the city remains unclear. He could have entered this city through the Diplonian Gate near the Kerameikos, as we have shown. The more obvious route on the west side of the city is through the Pyrean Gate.
What is clear is what the writer and storyteller in the book of Acts wants us to know. Paul's emotions were running high. He was agitated and in internal turmoil. He was scared for his life, coming to Athens, having fled violence from his fellow Jews in northern Greece. But then, what provoked him even more, the story claims, was the environment he confronted in the city. What the story in the book of Acts referred to in Greek as katedolon, a space full, saturated with images, a forest of idols.
In the urban areas of the Roman-controlled Mediterranean, statues surrounded people wherever they went. They were an integral part of the physical reality of everyday life. Unlike what we see in museums today, most statues were painted with bright, alluring colors, creating a vivid and magnificent surrounding. It would have been impossible to look away. Sculpted images appeared everywhere in the city, covering the urban landscape. A katedolon, a forest of images.
Why was this a problem for Paul? The Jews had a long-standing tradition against sculpture. This animosity went back to the second commandment of the Hebrew Bible. Let me quote for you. It says, "You shall not make for yourselves a graven image," end of quote. Many Jews understood this as a blanket prohibition against any kind of statues. In Paul's prior visit to Jerusalem, for example, he saw a city literally empty of sculpture, surely a striking contrast to the idol forest of the Roman world. But now he was in Athens, the epicenter of Greco-Roman culture.
We're at the base of the Acropolis, one of the most famous entryways of the ancient world, a majestic gateway leading to Athens' crown jewel, the Acropolis, a sanctuary of the goddess Athena. Come join me as we follow Paul, see what was going on in his mind. As he surely walked up the stairs of the Acropolis, Paul had to be struck by the inspiring environment. He was surrounded by shrines, towering facade with lengthy, imposing Doric columns, but most of all by an aura of sacredness and worship. This was the culmination of Athens' Via Sacra, the sacred way to enter the Acropolis. The book of Acts clearly communicates the agitation Paul felt about the religious rituals associated with sculpture. What is less known is that the condemning term idolatry appears for the first time in his writings. The word idolatry does not appear in the Bible or in any other Jewish writings from his time. For all we know, Paul was the first one to coin this term, which had a tremendous impact on Christianity and Western civilization in future generations.
The English word idolatry stems from a combination of two Greek words. The first, idol, from the Greek eidolon, derives from the verb to see and came to mean a picture or a figure. Ancient Jewish sources, like the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, use this noun to refer to all three-dimensional depictions of other gods that the Bible prohibits. The second half of idolatry, the Greek latreia, means work, specifically of the religious kind, namely the worship of gods. Idololatreia, literally the worship of figures.
At first glance, it seems that when Paul uses the word idolatry to refer to Roman sculpture, he follows the same condemning tone of the Hebrew Bible and Jewish religion in general. But careful attention to the nuances of this new term reveals an interesting conceptual innovation. By associating sculpture with their worship, Paul offers the possibility of a more lenient attitude towards sculpture that were not worshipped.
Today, we tend to view all the statues of ancient times as one group, referred to as sculptures, and in museums, they're usually displayed together. However, in the mind of ancient people, sculptures were divided and subdivided into different categories, like any group of species or objects.
There were statues of war heroes, like this general in his full uniform here, for example. There were other statues of emperors, like my good friend Hadrian right here. Everyone who saw him knew he was an emperor.
There are many other categories as well: local dignitaries, athletes, philosophers, divinities, mythological figures, all different groups that the ancients knew how to divide and how to perceive in a different way. One central classification that divided all statues of the Greco-Roman world into two major groups is that of divine nature. Ancient people believed that some of the statues that surrounded them had some godly quality to them, and they were venerated as divine. These are called worship statues.
Here's an example: the statue of the god Asclepius, the god of healing. For us, modern, it's in one room with all the other statues. But for ancient people, he was uniquely different. On a daily basis, there were a variety of activities associated with divine statues that separated them from other statues. There were ceremonies, there were sacrifices, there were rituals and processions, and all those made those statues unique and religious. Asclepius and many other statues like him were divine, sacred statues. All the other statues were just non-worshipped statues. They were there, but they were not divine, and they were not associated with the religious realm. This will help us understand the enormous significance of the category idolatry that Paul coined. If only statues that were worshipped were prohibited, then those that are not worshipped are okay. This is a groundbreaking and world-shattering innovation for Jews and later on for Christians. Why, you ask? Because this allows for the acceptance of the vast majority of statues of the Roman world, those that are not worshipped. And if you take it a step further, you can even interact with worshipped statues as long as you yourself do not worship them. Now, we don't know when this revolutionary idea first struck Paul, but he introduces it in his famous speech here in Athens just a few days after his arrival.
Paul went to various locations in Athens, including the local synagogue, spreading his vision about the end of the world. Some Greek philosophers belonging to the Epicurean and Stoic schools sensed his passion and commitment. They invited him to explain his beliefs at a prominent stone hill in the city, the Areopagos, named after Ares, the god of war. Numerous civic and religious activities took place atop this hill, and was also the seat of one of the city's councils.
Scholars have pored over the content of Paul's words in his sermon here on the Areopagos, but the attention they pay to his words have kept them from recognizing the significance of its location, right at the front door of the Acropolis, Athens' most prestigious religious center and an icon of Greco-Roman culture in general. This spatial proximity provides both the tone and context to Paul's speech. It's as if he's offering an alternative to what the Acropolis represents. For centuries, the speech, called a sermon, was seen as a clear plea for the monotheistic God and a condemnation of all other forms of worship. But I'm not sure that this is how Paul viewed his own words, or whether this is how it was heard by the crowd. Here's an alternative way to understand the Areopagos speech. Rather than condemning the gods of the Greeks, Paul uses the idea of worship and idolatry to reach out to them, showing them he understands their way of life. He gives them a path forward without needing to relinquish the realm of statues that was so central and essential to their life. It's as if he's saying to them, I know that you're looking to worship the unknown God. Well, I know who he is. Worship him properly, not through these idols and fake images of him. Nothing dramatic actually happened in Athens during or after Paul's visit. No one began shattering statues in the streets, and the masses did not start flocking to Christianity. This is hundreds of years in the future. The Temple of Athena, the Parthenon, continued to function at full steam for hundreds of years. But conceptually, the visit marks a watershed in world culture.
The consequences for Western civilization in the centuries to come were enormous. Paul paved a path for Christians in future generations to live in peace with the sculptural environment of the ancient world.